Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. This afternoon, I will be reading chapter 23. Wysteria, chapter 23. When they came to the door of the tavern, Will paused, telling Emily to wait for a moment. Then, opening the door and seeing nothing suspicious, he motioned for her to follow and entered the room. "Can I help you, my lord?" the bartender cheerfully inquired, as he and Emily stepped over to the counter. Will hesitated, unsure whether to ask for Lily or have a seat and wait for her to appear. But as he was about to speak, he saw her enter the room from a doorway at the back, carrying 3 large glass bottles. Lily smiled as their eyes locked. Then, after a quick glance at Emily, she crossed the room, set the bottles on the counter, and walked over to greet the couple. "How very nice to see you," she said, approaching them. Will felt his heartbeat quicken. "Good afternoon," he replied. She stepped close to him and stared into his eyes. "Yes, it is," she whispered softly. Will hoped she wouldn't try to kiss him, for at that moment, held in the grip of her penetrating gaze, he wasn't certain he could resist. As if reading his thoughts, she put her lips together, puckered slightly, and blew him the mere hint of a kiss. Then, taking a step back, she winked and turned her eyes to Emily, releasing Will from her spell. After examining Emily for a moment, she offered her a polite, if not sincere, smile, saying, "I don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Lily, this is Emily," Will said to her. "Yes, it is," she remarked dispassionately. Emily smiled and nodded. "Hi, Lily. Pleased to meet you." Lily returned a small curtsy. "Welcome," she said, as if reluctantly accepting her presence. "Any friend of Will's, as they say." "So, what brings you two here today? Thirst, perhaps?" It appeared she wouldn't be volunteering any information about her encounter with the visitor. "Actually, we wanted to talk to you," said Will. "How nice," she responded. "Come, let's have a seat." Lily ushered them to the nearest table, where they each took a chair. "You were speaking to a man in the square," Will began, deciding to approach the subject directly. "Gray jacket and hat, just a few minutes ago?" "Yes," she said, "I was." "Did he approach you?" Will asked her. "No, I approached him," she answered. The poor lad looked lost. He didn't know which way to go, but he knew what he was looking for. "What was that?" he inquired. "Her," she said, nodding toward Emily. "He was looking for Emily?" "Yes," she replied, "for you as well. But he was on the hunt for her." "And what did you tell him?" "I gave him directions," she said, the corners of her lips curling into a sly smile. "Directions? To where?" he asked. Lily sighed. "You should have let him go, Will." Just then, the front door opened, Will, whose seat faced the entrance, looked up and saw the very stranger about whom they were just speaking enter the room. He was no longer alone, however, but was accompanied by another man, tall, broad-shouldered and solidly built, with dark eyes and black shoulder-length hair combed back from his face. He was dressed neatly, all in black, and appeared to be in his mid-40s, much older than his friend. Will jumped to his feet, then shot a quick glance at Emily, who was sitting with her back to the door. She turned to see what had caused his sudden reaction, and, recognizing the man as their recent visitor, let out a gasp. Lily sat calmly, looking at the outsiders as if their appearance was no surprise to her. "You should have let him go," she said again, whispering her words as she stood up and slowly backed away from the table toward the bar. While his companion closed the door, the man in the gray jacket took a step forward, then stopped, looking first at Will, then at Lily, then at Emily, whereupon a smile appeared on his face. "Good afternoon," he said, in a rather jovial voice, tipping his hat, a short top hat with a wide brim. The other man, who now stood at his side, remained silent, directing a steady, unemotional stare at Will. Eyeing the two men apprehensively, Will said nothing in return. "It's Emily, is it not?" said their visitor. He chuckled when she didn't reply, taking her silence as confirmation. "Do I know you?" she asked him. "We may not have met formally," he said, "but we have a mutual acquaintance." "And who's that?" she said. He paused, as if debating whether to tell her. "Your friend, Charlotte," he replied. "What brings you here?" Will broke in, disturbed by the way he was looking at Emily. Their uninvited guest ignored Will, however, and continued staring at her, smiling as though very pleased with himself. "I can't believe we found you here," he said. "It's quite a remarkable surprise." "Excuse me," Will pronounced firmly. He was growing increasingly uncomfortable with both men's demeanor, the belligerent swagger of the one, and the cold, predatory stare of the other. It was time for them to leave. "I don't want to be inhospitable, but—" "Yes, yes," the man said, interrupting him, sounding irritated. He then turned to his companion and murmured something. "Emily," said Will, "perhaps you should let me speak to these gentlemen alone." She hesitated, but Will gave her a stern look, silently reminding her of her earlier promise to him. "No," said the cocky stranger, as Emily scooted her chair back from the table. "We'll be on our way soon enough." "And frankly," he added, glaring at Will, "I have nothing to say to you, my friend." He took a breath, paused, then nodded his head and said, "Now." Suddenly, his silent partner sprang forward, diving through the air, arms outstretched, like a large cat leaping at its prey. He flew over the table that stood between them, pouncing on Will, who tumbled backwards over his chair and onto the floor with the assailant on top of him. At the same time, the younger man lunged towards Emily, but before he reached her, She jumped to her feet and shoved her chair into his legs, tripping him up and sending him sprawling to the ground. Will struggled to get up, but his foe held him down, sitting with his full weight on Will's stomach while pinning his arms to the floor. The man was larger and more powerfully built than Will, but that didn't account for his crushing mass. The pressure on Will's diaphragm was so great that he could scarcely draw a breath. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Emily continuing to elude her assailant's grasp by dodging behind tables, kicking chairs into his path, and pelting him with whatever solid object she found within reach. Unable to come to her aid, Will tried to shout, "Jump!" but the weight on his stomach kept him from uttering much more than a whisper. He could not get enough air into his lungs and was beginning to feel lightheaded. Lily, who'd moved back to the bar, now grabbed one of the bottles from the counter and approached Will's attacker from behind. She lifted the bottle high, holding it like a club, and brought it down on the man's head, sending a shower of liquid and shattered glass onto Will's face and chest. The massive henchman, however, was unmoved by the blow. Lily tossed the broken neck of the bottle to the floor, then reached to her side and drew a small dagger from its sheath. Holding it with both hands, she drove the blade into the man's back. This seemed to get his attention, though he did little more than flinch. She struck a second time with greater force, and now his face showed pain. He released one of Will's wrists and swung his arm behind him, swatting at her. She dodged out of the way, then stepped back in, lifting the knife to attempt yet another strike. He swung blindly again, this time catching her in the chest, knocking her backwards off her feet. As the man leaned back to fend off Lily's attacks, Will felt the pressure lift from his body, allowing him to take a deep, welcome breath of air. He then struck the assailant squarely on the jaw with his free arm. The blow did no damage, but it seemed to anger him. He caught Will by the wrist and once again pinned his arm to the ground. In the midst of this chaos, Will's mind suddenly went calm. This shouldn't be happening, he thought. Not here, not in my world. Obviously, this person had the ability to control his body, making it unnaturally massive and powerful. Will could not alter that. But he wasn't powerless. He had control over everything else here. Creating a gale strong enough to blow the man off of him wasn't an option in this confined space. It would surely bring down the building on them all. But Will saw another solution. Ultimately, gravity was responsible for the man's tremendous weight. And since this was an element of his world, he focused his mind on the space above his adversary, creating a path of least resistance to counteract his mass. Then, summoning as much strength as he could into his own body, Will pushed his heels down against the floor and thrust up with his pelvis and arms, at the same time emptying his lungs with a primal roar. The array of forces Will had managed to muster blasted the dark-eyed intruder into the air. He shot straight up, slamming hard against the heavy beams on the ceiling. Then, as Will rolled to one side, allowing the environment to return to its natural state as he did so, the man dropped and crashed to the floor. Will jumped to his feet just in time to see Emily's foe throw aside a table that stood between them, then lunge forward and grab her by the wrist. As Will began moving to her rescue, he heard Lily shout his name from behind. Turning, he saw his powerful opponent, who'd quickly recovered from the fall, leap from the ground at him. Will spun out of the way, this time evading his feline attack. The man flew past him and collided with an upturned table, then nimbly hopped to his feet, fixing his aim on Will and crouching, preparing to launch himself again. As long as Will was occupied with repelling these attacks, he couldn't help Emily. This had to end. He needed a weapon. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a large cast-iron cauldron sitting next to the fireplace. That will do, he thought. As the villain leapt, the cauldron sailed through the air, smashing into him just as his feet left the floor. The impact drove the man across the room and into the wall near the door, where he collapsed in a heap with a heavy piece of iron cradled in his lap. Then Will headed straight for Emily, who was struggling to free herself. Seeing Will upright and approaching him, Emily's captor glanced over at his battered accomplice, who was moving but seemed barely conscious. Fear crossed his face as he realized he'd lost his muscle, and with it, the battle. The man let go of Emily's arm and started to back away, presumably to flee. But Emily, rather than retreat, reached forward and caught him by the wrist. "Not so fast," she said. He tried to pull his arm loose, but she seized it with both hands and dug in her heels. Unable to break away, Emily's captor, now captive, cocked his free arm, preparing to strike her in the face. As Will scrambled through the tangle of tables and chairs to get to her, a bottle flew past his head, hitting the man in the chest with a thud, then shattering when it hit the floor. Emily released her grip and jumped away as her stunned assailant stumbled backwards and fell to the ground. Will rushed forward and grabbed Emily by the arm, pulling her back and imposing himself between her and the enemy. He considered charging after the man, but was hesitant to leave her side. For though both men seemed to be beaten, he couldn't be certain the fight was over. In obvious pain, the stricken intruder crawled over to his comrade and pushed the cauldron off his legs. "Anton," he said, shaking him, while keeping a fearful eye on Will. "Time to go. This was a mistake." Will noticed him send a quick glance toward the ground near his feet. Looking down, he saw the man's hat, which he'd lost at some point in the fray. Will picked it up, examined it for a moment, then tossed it to its owner, who seemed grateful to get it back. "Next time," Will warned him sternly. "There won't be a next time," he said, placing the hat on his head. "We won't be troubling you again." He took his partner's arm, and the two trespassers thoroughly defeated, dissolved away. Well, that was exciting. And we will return immediately with part 2.